My name is Elena Ward, and on the first day of my new position, I was fired by the CEO's son. He did not know I had built the compliance infrastructure that kept their family's entire operation from collapsing. The air conditioning too strong for October, and the paper he handed me still smelled like toner. Your role has been rendered redundant, he said, not looking up. At home, I opened the folder I had quietly compiled over 4 years' internal emails, asset flows, whistleblower statements. I had warned his father once. Just once. We met during a regulatory audit. He was the heir-in-training, and I was the quiet consultant, flown in to untangle discrepancies, buried 2 fiscal years deep. He was charming in a studied way, the kind of man who'd been told to. Often he was impressive. I was not impressed. That is what intrigued him. Our first real conversation happened over a broken printer at 11 p.m. We laughed once. Then he asked if I would ever consider staying beyond the project. It was the first time someone in that building had asked what I wanted. 6 months later, I joined permanently director of Ethics and Oversight. His father approved. We worked in adjacent offices, slowly growing into a rhythm that felt, for a time, like shared ambition. I focused on compliance systems, internal reporting frameworks, the architecture of accountability. He hovered at the top of strategic meetings, steering public vision, cultivating legacy. We moved in together the year the company went public, an old townhome with sunlit bay windows and creaking floorboards that we pretended to mind. I restored the banister myself. The house was symbolic from the start, as tastes, my labor. Still, I believed in us, in what we were building, both inside the company and beyond it. The inheritance came from my mother, an oncologist turned advocate, who passed down more than wealth. It was a trust fund she had protected from scrutiny, left intentionally separate from my professional life, with clauses that could only be unlocked by death, divorce, or proven fraud. I did not speak of it often, but he knew. I told him after my mother's funeral, standing in her study where she had kept every journal I wrote as a child, boxed and labeled. He said it was generous of her, and then, in a quieter tone, well-deserved though. It was the first time I noticed he said things the way people rehearse speeches, sincere in cadence, not in content. Over time, his questions about the fund became casual. What are the limitations again? Would it ever be taxable? He never asked how I felt about it, just how it worked. But I would remember those moments later, the asymmetry, the emotional coldness cloaked in competence. I had built something sturdy between us. He had merely leaned on it, waiting for his moment. The first password change happened after a conference. In Geneva, he had left in a rush, one of those last-minute international engagements that seemed increasingly to blur in and out of his calendar without much explanation. I noticed it the morning after he returned while trying to access our joint digital archive documents we both maintained mostly for household logistics. The login failed 3 times before I was locked out. He said it was a systems update. You know how these platforms are, he added, shrugging. I nodded. I did not ask again. 2 weeks later, a bank notification came through for a wire transfer. I did not recognize Mall, but oddly timed. I asked once. He said it was reimbursement from a colleague, something about splitting hotel expenses overseas. Not dramatic ones, but subtle absences in tone, delayed glances, the way he responded with generic affection when I spoke about my work. I began to feel like a placeholder in conversations. He had already exited in his mind. Friends noticed before I admitted it to myself. My sister asked why he had skipped our anniversary dinner. I told her he had been in meetings all day. She said gently, "You don't sound sure." Another friend mentioned seeing him alone at a gallery opening in a city he was not supposed to be in. I dismissed it. The lies we tell ourselves are often smoother than the truths we fear. Still, I started watching more closely. Passwords continued to shift, streaming services, utility portals, even shared notes. I once found a reservation confirmation in the trash folder of our inbox. Dated for a week, I was certain he had been in meetings. A single dinner, 2 names, 1 city. I did not confront him. Instead, I let it collect. I kept a notebook, leather-bound, gifted to me by my mother for my first board presentation. In it, I logged timestamps, fragments, little discrepancies that would have seemed paranoid in isolation but formed a pattern in accumulation. The moment that stays with me is smaller than all the rest. We were sitting in the living room, the same space we once designed together, and he was scrolling through his phone, backlit by the blue-gray of evening. I asked if he had seen the email from our attorney about renewing the terms of the trust. He said, "Without looking up, you handle those things." And in that flat response, I understood something foundational had shifted. Not because of what he said, but because of what he no longer bothered to pretend. That was when the coldness stopped being temporary. That was when I stopped calling it distance and started calling it strategy. It began with a name I did not recognize and unfamiliar. Gmail address listed as a recovery contact on our shared cloud storage. I had logged in out of habit, intending to pull an old contractor agreement. Instead, I found the permissions had changed. Certain folders had been marked private. I moved slowly. Not because I was uncertain, but because I knew I would only get one chance to open everything before he noticed. In a subfolder buried under tax documents, I found a scan of a property lease. The address was in Portland. He had never once mentioned Portland. The signature was his. Alongside it were bank routing slips amounts, siphoned from our joint account, funneled monthly into what he had labeled future holdings. Each transfer was below reporting thresholds. Each one bore a timestamp that coincided with his international travel. There was also a PDF outlining renovation plans for the new property. They were signed not by him but by someone named Alina Torres, listed as a domestic consultant. I Googled her name. She was not a contractor. She was a personal stylist. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even sit down. I simply began printing. Every document, every photo, every forwarding rule from his inbox. Screenshots of calendar invites. Metadata, timestamps, file modification logs. I downloaded everything to an encrypted drive I kept in my office drawer, alongside old campaign records and corporate whistleblower forms. I backed that up again in a legal timelock vault my attorney had once suggested I use just in case. When I was done, I stared at the printer's final page, sliding out. One of his email threads with the subject line, "Moving clean and quiet." I remember standing there watching the toner cool and thinking, he assumed I was too trusting to verify. That was the flaw. That was the crack he never thought would matter. I walked through the house with a new gaze, each room recast in hindsight. The fireplace mantel we once argued about, Ha had wanted stone. He had insisted on reclaimed wood. "It needs to photograph well," he had said. Now I saw it for what it was, a showroom. The kitchen backsplash chosen for resale value, not warmth. The hallway photos curated memories, all of them dated before the inheritance. My eyes caught on a silver frame beside the stairwell, the two of us in Malta 4 years ago. He had asked a stranger to take it, arm around my waist, smile not, quite reaching his eyes. I lifted the frame and opened the back. The photograph had been printed over another one, faded edges barely visible. My mother and I at a lecture she had given, her arm around me, same smile. I replaced the frame face down. I did not accuse. I archived. That night I opened a blank page and began cataloging everything: accounts, passwords, signatures, timestamps, shell companies, lease. I used the template I had created for Risk Audits 1. I had written for executives like him, men who believed structure was their shield. I knew the language. I marked files with annotations: potential fraud vector, violation of fiduciary duty, unreported asset real. I copied only facts, dates, locations, names, no adjectives, no emotional coloring. By the time I closed the file, the case had already taken shape. The betrayal had not ended me. It had simply activated a different part of Mitha, one he had underestimated all along. The first call I made was to Adrian Lane, a senior trust and estate attorney I had quietly kept on retainer for years. Againly, at my mother's insistence, and later because I had learned to respect Adrian's ability to say devastating things in immaculate legal terms. We met in a private conference room downtown. No assistants, no records. I handed her the encrypted drive and a folder of printed documents. She read in silence, her eyes moving with increasing stillness, her fingers never once breaking rhythm. When she finished, she looked up and her tone did not shift. "That is attempted embezzlement," she said, as though commenting on a poorly prepared will. "Your inheritance is under legal protection. He cannot legally access it. And if he tried to, we have everything we need to make that case airtight." She paused, then added, "You have not spoken to him about this yet?" I shook my head once. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." From there, we began assembling the skeleton of quiet retaliation. I was to speak to no one, no friends, no family, not even my sister, who had begun to suspect something was wrong. Adrian set up real-time monitoring alerts across all accounts that touched or even bordered the trust. I contracted a forensic IT specialist to run an IP trace across the emails. I had recovered every login, every forwarding path, every unauthorized attempt to reroute communications or mask digital footprints. The data came back fast. He had used my mother's name to authorize a transfer he could not complete, because the signature on file was digitally bound to her medical death certificate. The attempt had flagged the trustee's internal system, but without context they had not escalated now. They would. We documented it all. Every search, every login, every new password change he made was mirrored and stored. He did not know I was inside his shadows, watching him walk through the motions of control he no longer had. I began preemptive work with a financial advisor, Margot. someone I trusted implicitly who helped me initiate the process of asset decoupling. Our joint accounts were frozen. Under legal review, credit access was severed cleanly without notice. I left his name on certain documents intentionally, so alerts would trigger quietly, signaling the beginning of unraveling without a single conversation. He noticed eventually small things. A declined card? A missing deposit? He texted once simply, "Did something bounce?" I did not reply. That same afternoon, I filed a security memorandum with the internal board counsel not as a whistleblower, but as a strategic auditor. I cited potential breach of fiduciary alignment and attached a time-stamped document trail that required immediate executive review. By protocol, that meant the company's legal department, not his father, would be looped in first. I did not need to. I moved through each step with the precision of someone who had watched too many men escape accountability through the fog of emotion. I gave him no fog, no voice messages, no outbursts, only silence and consequence. I was not seeking revenge. I was executing a legal response to a failed fraud. What he had underestimated most was not my intelligence, but my preparedness. I had spent years building systems for people like him, warning boards about exposure, designing controls for failures they believed would never reach them, and now I was simply using the tools I had always trusted: law, data, time. I did not need to punish him. I only needed to prove what he had done and let the mechanisms I once built quietly close around him. He called the meeting himself. If we could talk like adults, his phrasing brittle with the kind of superiority that only survives when left unchallenged, I agreed. We met in his office, the one he had assumed control of the day after his father stepped down. He was already seated when I arrived, hands folded, face composed in that performative calm I had watched him perfect for years. The door clicked shut behind me. I did not sit. He gestured vaguely toward the chair across from him, then leaned back with a faint smirk that did not reach his eyes. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "Some accounts have been restricted, and I'm assuming it's an error." I figured we could just clear the air before it becomes awkward. I looked at him without answering. When I finally spoke, my voice was neutral, almost clinical. It was not an error. He blinked once, taken aback by the flatness of the response. He laughed, lightly rehearsed. "Okay," he said, "then maybe a little overreaction on your part. You've been distant." I did not. He leaned forward, elbows on the table now, the mask slipping just enough to show his discomfort. "Look, if this is about money, we can have that conversation. I've been managing a lot property investments. There may have been some wires you didn't approve, but they were all for us, for our future." He smiled then, trying to reestablish the familiar balance where he spoke in justifications and I softened the landing. But this time, I didn't offer relief. "The future is no longer mutual," I said evenly. That was when something inside him flickered recognition, followed by fear disguised as indignation. "You're overstepping," he snapped too quickly. "You don't even understand how some of this works." I tilted my head slightly. "I built the compliance protocols you're about to violate. I understand exactly how this works." He stood, suddenly agitated, pacing the carpet in measured steps, feigning composure. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You don't have proof. And even if you think you do, this isn't the kind of thing you want public." He turned then, expecting that would land, that I would flinch. I didn't. "It is not public," I said calmly. "It is legal. You've already received your first notice. You'll receive another by week's end." He stared at me, and for the first time the silence was his. I did not fill it. His voice lowered, defensive now. "We don't need to destroy each other over this." I met his gaze without blinking. Only one of us tried. My tone never rose. My posture never shifted, and as he searched my face for softness, some remaining lever, I offered him nothing. No rage, no grief, no opening. Just the sound of the door as I closed it behind me, leaving him in a room where his authority no longer held weight. The unraveling began not with a headline or confrontation, but with a silence his lawyer could not explain. It started when she received the full forensic package from my attorney, a meticulously indexed collection of documents. Digital logs, account transfers, property records, and one line of metadata that placed him irrefutably in the least. Portland apartment on a day he had claimed to be in Zurich. The IP log alone was enough to destroy the foundation of plausible deniability. It was time-stamped, location-stamped, and matched with a restaurant receipt he had charged to our joint card that same evening. The legal term was deliberate misrepresentation with intent to defraud. He had signed documents under false pretense, transferred funds outside of disclosed marital accounts, and attempted to leverage the trust's capital base through shell routing, all while masking his location and actions behind his family's name. When his lawyer called mine for clarification, she was told there would be no discussion. The documentation stood on its own. There was nothing to interpret, only to acknowledge the accounts had been his mistake. In his attempt to remain subtle, he had siphoned money in fragments, $3,800 here, $7,200 there, amounts just under compliance reporting thresholds, redirected through boutique banks under the pretense of investment portfolios, but the pattern was unambiguous. The funds landed in a property account attached to a business he had incorporated under a false name 2 years earlier, and that business registered at the same mailing address where his so-called consultant received quarterly invoices. He believed the segmentation made it invisible. He did not realize I had designed systems for living systems that caught what people like him assumed would slip through. His father's firm, once a wall of protection, began to distance itself. As the evidence mounted, the internal audit I triggered moved faster than expected. It was not just the financial breach, it was the reputational risk. When I submitted my report, I included a summary statement citing breach of trust, probable misappropriation, and violations of internal fiduciary expectations. The legal team flagged it for board-level attention. He was removed from a strategic planning session without ceremony. Later that week, a neighbor testified to seeing him with a woman, not his wife, moving boxes into the Portland address. Months before the lease appeared in our accounts, she was careful in her words, but clear. He said it was temporary. I thought it was a business thing, but he had a key. That statement was notarized. Within days, he changed attorneys. The second one called mine directly less arrogant, more cautious. "We'd like to avoid a hearing," he said. "Is there any room for resolution?" The answer was no. The court date had already been set. And though he postured as if he might fight it, we both knew he would not. Not with the paper trail. Not with the trust clause he had violated in writing. Not with the forensic evidence, the witness testimony, the breach notifications. His case was not one of ambiguity, it was arithmetic. A matter of proof, not persuasion. The final blow was quiet. During preliminary filings, he submitted a motion to seal proceedings, citing reputational harm. The judge denied it. "This case concerns legal integrity," she said, "not personal embarrassment." I attended the pre-hearing without expression. He entered with his new lawyer, suit pressed, hands folded too tightly to suggest calm. He looked at me once, searching for reaction. I gave him none. Everything he feared, exposure, consequence, failure, was already in motion, not through vengeance, but through documentation. I did not have to speak. The proof did that for me. Every lie, every theft, every deception reduced to a line of data and a name only he had signed. The settlement was not dramatic. It arrived in the form of a clean 5-page agreement, return of misappropriated funds, dissolution of remaining joint assets, permanent forfeiture of claims against the trust, and a non-disclosure clause drafted in language so precise it left no air for ambiguity. He did not contest the terms, not because he agreed with them, but because he finally understood the difference between negotiation and consequence. He had not been offered a compromise. He had been given an exit. And even that, I allowed for dignity's sake. There would be no criminal charges, not because he deserved leniency, but because the truth, now preserved in legal record, was enough. His name would never be scrubbed from the filings. His actions would never be forgotten by the people who mattered. That was justice enough. We met once more briefly in the law firm's private conference room to sign the final documents. He looked smaller, thinner maybe, or simply stripped of whatever illusion he had once worn so easily. He tried to smile as I entered, but the gesture collapsed before it could reach his mouth. I sat, signed my portion without hesitation, and waited while he finished his. There was no conversation, only the scrape of pen against paper and the quiet ritual of consequence being finalized. As he slid the last page across the table, he looked at me, voice low, almost pleading. "You didn't have to destroy me." I met his eyes, calm and unflinching. "It was never about destroying you," I said. "It was about truth." He lowered his gaze, and in that moment I understood fully. He had never expected to be held accountable, not by the law, and certainly not by me. I stood, gathering my copy of the documents, and before I left, I said the only thing that remained. "You took what was never yours to begin with. I only made sure it was returned." Then I walked out quiet, whole, and done. There was no bitterness in me, only stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm that never needed to be loud to be devastating. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me I had not already reclaimed. I sold the house without ceremony. The agent asked if I wanted to keep any of the staging furniture, but I told her to leave everything exactly as it was. It had always been more his than mine, a curated illusion, built for appearances, not for permanence. I signed the closing papers on a Tuesday morning and dropped the keys in a plain envelope. I did not linger in the doorway or walk through the rooms one last time. That place had already emptied itself of meaning the moment I saw it. For what it truly was, a structure designed to contain silence, not love. I left the silver frame behind, face down. Some things are better left unread bleed, with the trust. Secure again. I restructured the inheritance into something living in endowment in my mother's name. The Margaret Ward Foundation would fund legal aid clinics for women navigating financial coercion, offering them not just protection but clarity. I also created a fellowship in regulatory ethics quietly anonymously through a university she once lectured at. It was not revenge, it was restoration. A way of translating what had been almost taken from me into something that could never be taken from someone else. I did not speak publicly about what happened, I never will. But the legacy now carries its own voice and it speaks exactly as it should. Without apology, without spectacle, without needing to be louder than truth. I spent the evening of the final transfer walking along the river path, where my mother and I used to go when she needed to think. I brought with me a sapling, small, quiet, stubborn in the way life insists on returning. I planted it near the water's edge, anchoring it in the soil with my own hands. No one watched. There was no audience. Just the wind, the current, and the soft steadiness of earth accepting something new. Later that night I had dinner with my sister. We did not speak of him. We spoke of our mother, of books we both wanted to read, of things that had nothing to do with the past. It was enough. He broke what I gave him freely. I build what no one can steal. I rebuild in silence. That is where strength lives.